The city buzzed with its usual rhythm. Cars honking, street vendors calling out, and footsteps blending into a quiet hum. Underneath the calm, however, darkness always lurked in the unnoticed corners. It was one of those days where everything seemed normal until suddenly it wasn't. Tasha Johnson didn't stand out much in a crowd. At least, not at first glance. She was in her early 30s, wore simple, practical clothes, black joggers, a light hoodie, and carried herself with quiet confidence. Her braided hair fell neatly to her shoulders, and a plain gym bag was slung over her arm as she made her way through a side street. What no one could tell from her unassuming appearance was that Tasha had been through more battles than most people could imagine. Her body was a carefully trained machine. Her mind, sharper than a blade, because Tasha Johnson wasn't just anybody, she was one of the Navy SEAL's most elite members. But not everyone sees beyond the surface. As Tasha walked, the evening shadows stretched across the walls like grasping fingers. She had just left a local gym after a quick training session and was headed back to her car parked a block away. She liked taking these solo walks. Being alone helped clear her head, gave her time to process. Her training in the SEALs had taught her to value silence, to observe, to be aware. It started small, a distant laugh echoing off the alley walls, then another. At first, Tasha barely noticed. She continued walking, hands in her hoodie pockets, eyes scanning the surroundings the way she always did, a habit of survival. The laughter grew louder. Usher. A group of 4 men emerged from the shadows, lingering at the mouth of the alleyway ahead. They were young, rough around the edges, wearing ripped jeans, oversized jackets, and sneakers worn thin. The kind of guys who thrived on making themselves feel bigger by tearing someone else down. Tasha's footsteps slowed slightly as she assessed the scene. Years of training kicked in automatically. She took in the men's postures, cocky, aggressive, and their expressions, which held that cruel kind of amusement she had seen too many times before. Her instinct was to avoid confrontation, keep moving, but she already knew these types. They wouldn't let her just walk past. "Hey, sweetheart," one of the men called out. His voice was dripping with mock sweetness, but the sneer on his face gave him away. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" Tasha ignored him and kept walking, calm and composed. She had dealt with far worse. "Hey, I'm talking to you," another voice barked, sharper this time. The man stepped into her path, blocking her way. He was taller than her, broad-shouldered, and his friends quickly circled around to flank him, cutting off her escape. The leader stepped forward, a wiry man with a jagged scar across his eyebrow and a crooked smirk. "What's wrong?" "Cat got your tongue." He tilted his head, looking her up and down with a mix of arrogance and disrespect. "Didn't anyone teach you to answer when spoken to?" Tasha's jaw tightened, but her expression remained neutral. Her heart rate didn't spike. Her breathing stayed steady. Years of combat missions have conditioned her to stay cool under pressure. She knew what was coming next. "You don't belong here," another man hissed, stepping closer. The bitterness in his voice was laced with something uglier than hatred. "Thinking you can just walk around like you own the place." Tasha could smell trouble now. Their intent was clear. She glanced at the surroundings quickly. The alley was narrow, boxed in by 2 brick walls, a dumpster, and little room to maneuver. Perfect for their trap, or so they thought. The wiry leader sneered again, clearly mistaking her silence for fear. "Oh, I see how it is. Think you're better than us, huh?" He shoved her shoulder roughly, expecting her to stumble back. Tasha barely moved. She didn't even flinch. That only made them angrier. The leader's smirk turned into a scowl. "You deaf or just dumb?" One of the other men leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "Maybe she doesn't know what's about to happen to her," he taunted, his voice dripping with venom. Tasha finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "You really don't want to do this." The leader laughed, a sharp bark that echoed off the walls. "Oh, what's little Miss Tough Girl gonna do?" His friends joined in, their laughter bouncing around like cruel echoes, but Tasha stayed motionless. Her gaze flicked to each of them, memorizing their faces, their stances, and the positions of their hands. She could hear the tension building, the restless shuffling of shoes against pavement. "You've got no idea who you're messing with," she said quietly, her voice steady as stone. "Oh, we'll see about that." The first swing came suddenly, a wild punch aimed straight at her face. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Most people in Tasha's position would have panicked, but her body reacted on instinct. She shifted just enough to let the punch graze past her cheek and countered with a move so fast, so precise, that it was over before anyone knew what had happened. The man stumbled back, clutching his wrist, howling in pain. His friends froze, their expressions flickering between shock and rage. They had no idea what they were dealing with, but Tasha did. She dropped her gym bag to the ground with a soft thud and took a step forward. The quiet confidence in her movement sent an unspoken message. "Last chance," she said evenly. "Walk away." The leader snarled, his pride clearly stung. "Get her," he roared. The 3 remaining men lunged all at once, but they were too slow, too sloppy. Tasha moved like a shadow, dodging their attacks effortlessly. Her fists and elbows struck with pinpoint accuracy, disarming them with a combination of speed and force they didn't expect. A kick sent one man sprawling into the dumpster with a loud crash. Another crumpled to his knees, gasping for air after a perfectly placed blow to his midsection. By the time the last man realized what was happening, Tasha had already pinned him against the wall, her arm pressed firmly against his neck. He stared at her with wide, terrified eyes, the arrogance completely gone now. What are you?" he stammered. Tasha leaned in slightly, her voice calm but cold. "I told you, you didn't want to do this." She released him and stepped back. He stumbled away, clutching his throat, barely able to breathe. The others were still groaning on the ground, too stunned to move. Tasha grabbed her gym bag and walked away without another word, her footsteps echoing the silence she left behind. The men who thought they'd found an easy target now knew the truth. They had messed with the wrong woman. And this was just the beginning. Tasha didn't look back as she walked out of the alley, her movements calm and deliberate, as though nothing had happened. The gym bag swung lightly in her hand, and her breathing remained steady. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. Men like those, angry, arrogant, and looking for someone to blame for their frustrations, were everywhere. But tonight felt different. There had been something more in their taunts, something uglier. She reached her car, a simple beat-up sedan she'd chosen on purpose. It wasn't flashy, and that was the point. Seals like her understood the value of blending in. As she unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, her mind lingered on the encounter. She replayed it like a movie, frame by frame, their body language, their slurred words, the wildness in their eyes. It wasn't just a random confrontation. It felt intentional. Tasha sighed and rested her hands on the wheel for a moment. She thought about calling it in, but what would she say? A group of young guys trying to pick a fight and lost. It wouldn't be the first time someone had judged her by the color of her skin or her appearance, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Most people had no idea who she was or what she'd been through. Her thoughts drifted back to her training days, the grueling weeks of BUD/S training, where the Navy SEAL candidates were pushed to their physical and mental limits. Hours of sleepless nights, freezing ocean swims, sun sticking to her skin until it felt like it was part of her. She'd been the only black woman in her class. Everyone had doubted her, from instructors to teammates. They whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Asterisk, she won't make it. Asterisk, but she did. Tasha's lips curled into the faintest smile as she remembered the day she graduated. She proved everyone wrong, not through words, but through grit, focus, and unmatched determination. Now, no matter where she went, she carried that part of herself, a quiet force. The memory faded as a flash of movement in her rearview mirror pulled her back to the present. She turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse, one of the men from the alley. He was peering around the corner of the building, watching her. Tasha's fingers gripped the steering wheel. She stayed still, her eyes following him through the mirror. He wasn't coming toward her, but the fact that he was still lingering wasn't a good sign. After a few moments, he disappeared back into the alley, leaving the street empty again. She exhaled slowly and started the car, pulling out of the spot and heading toward the main road. But her instincts wouldn't let her drop it. Something wasn't right. Those men hadn't just been looking for trouble, they'd been waiting for someone like her. Watching. Testing. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring as she passed by blocks of businesses closing for the night. Tasha lived alone in a small apartment just outside the city. It wasn't much. A living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom. But it was hers. The walls were bare except for a single photo of her parents and brother, all smiles, sitting on the mantel. They didn't know the details of her job. They didn't need to. All they knew was that she had become what she always wanted to be, a protector. She tossed her gym bag on the couch and headed to the kitchen, pulling out a bottle of water. The silence in her apartment was heavy, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Tasha leaned against the counter, sipping slowly. Her body was relaxed, but her mind buzzed with thoughts. She didn't scare easily, that had been trained out of her years ago, but something about tonight left her uneasy. People like those guys didn't usually back down quietly, especially not after being humiliated. She knew their type. They'd lick their wounds and come back angrier. Maybe tonight had been random. Maybe it hadn't. Either way, Tasha wasn't the kind of woman to ignore a gut feeling. She took out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for an old teammate, Riley Jones. Riley had been her closest friend during SEAL training. They'd both graduated the same year and had stayed close ever since. He now worked in private security but still knew how to handle situations that didn't add up. "Hey, Riley," Tasha said when he picked up. "Tash, long time, no hear. What's going on?" "You busy?" "I'm in between jobs. What's up?" "I ran into something tonight. A group of guys tried to corner me on my way back to my car. I handled it, but something about it felt off. It wasn't random." Riley's tone grew serious. "You okay?" "Yeah." They didn't know what they were dealing with, but I think they were waiting for someone like me. "Like you?" Tasha hesitated. "A black woman. Alone." There was a pause on the other end. "You're saying they were targeting people?" "I don't know yet. Could just be my gut talking, but something about the whole thing isn't sitting right with me. I saw one of them watching me afterward, like they weren't finished." Riley sighed. "You want me to look into it? I've got a few contacts who might know if there's been any trouble like that in your area." "Yeah, I'd appreciate it. Just a hunch, but..." "Your hunches are usually right, Tash. I'll get back to you." "Thanks, Riley." Tasha hung up the phone and stared at the dark window across the room. Her reflection looked back at her, calm, steady, unbothered. But her mind wasn't letting it go. She knew this feeling. It was the same instinct that had saved her life overseas more times than she could count. Something was brewing, and she wasn't about to ignore it. The next day, the city was back to its usual rhythm, but Tasha noticed things more sharply now. She had always been observant, but now her senses were on high alert. She picked up on the small things. Unfamiliar faces loitering outside shops, eyes lingering on her just a little too long, groups of men gathered in alleyways. As she passed a coffee shop, she felt it again, that feeling of being watched. She turned her head slightly, catching a man sitting in a parked car across the street. He was looking at her, his expression blank, like he didn't care if she noticed. It was bold. Tasha crossed the street, walking calmly but directly toward his car. The man's expression flickered as she approached, but he didn't move. She stopped a few feet from his window and looked straight at him. "You lost?" she asked, her voice sharp. The man smirked faintly, but didn't answer. Instead, he started the car, pulled away from the curb, and disappeared into traffic. Tasha watched him go, her jaw tightening. This wasn't random anymore. Someone was watching her. Someone who didn't know they'd picked the wrong woman. Tasha stood there for a moment longer, the hum of the traffic filling the space where the man's car had been. Her instincts screamed that this wasn't over. She couldn't put a name to it yet, but something bigger was at play. Pulling her phone from her pocket, she scrolled through her recent calls and dialed Riley again. It rang twice before he picked up. "Tell me you've got something," Tasha said, skipping any formalities. "I'm working on it," Riley replied, his tone cautious. "I reached out to a couple of my people. There's been some chatter about a group. Small time, but dangerous. Guys with too much free time and nothing but anger to fill it. They've been stirring up trouble in certain neighborhoods. Harassment, vandalism, stuff that escalates when no one stops it." Tasha listened, a gaze fixed on the spot where the car had been parked. "How targeted is it?" "Very. From what I'm hearing, they're choosing people. The kind of people they think won't fight back." Riley paused. "They don't know who they're messing with, Tash. I can come up there, run some recon if you want." Tasha shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. "Not yet. I need to understand what's happening first. If I bring you in, they'll know someone's onto them." "You sure?" "Yeah, I'll keep my eyes open." "Tasha," Riley hesitated, "be careful. You know how these things go. Small groups can get bold fast, and bold turns dangerous." "I know," Tasha said, her voice calm but firm. "I've dealt with worse." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Riley wasn't wrong. Groups like this fed off power, the illusion of it, at least. It started with intimidation and escalated as soon as they thought they could get away with it. Tasha had seen it before, overseas and here at home. The difference was, most people didn't have the training to push back. The rest of the day passed in a haze of hyper-awareness. Everywhere Tasha went, she felt eyes on her. At the grocery store, in line for gas, even walking down the quiet hallways of her apartment building. Maybe it was paranoia, but she doubted it. Her instincts were honed razor sharp, and ignoring them had never done her any favors. That night, she sat on her couch, staring at the blank television screen, the low hum of the refrigerator in the background. She thought about those men again, the anger in their voices, the way they had circled her like predators who had found an easy target. Except she wasn't easy prey, and they had learned it the hard way. A soft knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Tasha's entire body tensed. She never got visitors, certainly not this late. She stood up slowly, moving quietly across the living room to look through the peephole. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Fields, a kind older woman who lived down the hall. Tasha opened the door a crack. "Mrs. Fields, everything okay?" The woman looked nervous, wringing her hands as she glanced over her shoulder at the empty hallway. "Sorry to bother you so late, dear, but I thought you should know. There were some men hanging around outside earlier. Young men with loud voices and rude manners. They were near your car." Tasha's stomach tightened, though her face remained calm. "Did they say anything to you?" Mrs. Fields shook her head quickly. No. I don't think they even noticed me. I was coming back from my walk, and I saw them staring at your car like they were waiting for something or someone. I didn't like the look of it. I just thought you should know." "Thank you, Mrs. Fields. I'll keep an eye out." The older woman gave her a tight, worried smile and shuffled back down the hall. Tasha watched her go before closing the door and locking it. Her thoughts churned as she walked back to the couch. First, they followed her. Now they were showing up near her home. They were testing her, seeing how far they could go before she reacted. Tasha knew their type well enough to know they wouldn't stop. Not unless she stopped them first. That night, sleep didn't come easy. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the hours ticked by. Every noise outside, the rumble of a car, the faint sound of footsteps, kept her alert. By the time the sun began to bleed light across the horizon, she was already dressed and ready for the day. Instead of heading to the gym, she drove to a quieter part of town, where Riley had told her she might find more answers. It wasn't an official lead, but she wasn't looking for official. She was looking for anyone who might know the group, where they hung out, what they were after. The area was rougher than where she lived. Buildings sat with cracked windows and faded signs. Groups of people stood near the sidewalks, their conversations pausing as they watched her drive past. Tasha parked her car a block away from an old diner and made her way down the street. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for yet, but trouble had a way of showing itself if you paid close enough attention. It didn't take long. Across the street, leaning against a graffiti-covered wall, she spotted one of the men from the alley. He wasn't the leader, but he was familiar. His wiry frame and cocky posture were burned into her memory. He was laughing with another guy, completely unaware that Tasha had stopped to watch. She crossed the street, her steps silent. When she got close enough, the man's laughter cut off. He turned to face her, surprise flickering across his face before it turned into a smirk. "Well, look who it is," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You following me now?" Tasha stopped a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "You and your friends have been busy." The other man, a heavy-set guy with a scar running down his cheek, looked between them. "What's this about?" "She's the one Marcus was talking about," the wiry man said, his grin widening. "The one who thinks she's tough." Tasha's eyes narrowed. "Where's Marcus?" The grin faltered for a second. "Why? You looking for round two?" "I'm looking for answers." The man scoffed and pushed himself off the wall, taking a step closer. "You think you scare me? You're nothing but—" Tasha cut him off. "Careful." Something in her tone made the man stop mid-sentence. It wasn't loud or angry, but it carried weight. The heavy-set man seemed to pick up on it, nudging his friend. "Let's go. She's not worth it." The wiry man hesitated, looking like he wanted to argue, but his friend had already started walking. He glared at Tasha for a long moment before following. As they disappeared around the corner, Tasha let out a slow breath. She'd rattled them, but not enough. They weren't afraid of her yet, but they were starting to realize she wasn't like their usual targets. Tasha knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Tasha didn't move for a long moment after the two men disappeared. She stood there, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her mind was a storm of calculations. This wasn't some group of aimless thugs anymore. The way they talked, the way they watched her, it was personal now. Whatever had started in that alley wasn't just lingering. It was spreading like a crack in glass, growing larger the more pressure was applied. She turned and walked back to her car, every step deliberate and controlled. Sliding into the driver's seat, she sat still for a moment, letting the engine hum to life. The streets around her were waking up, people shuffling about on the sidewalks, cars rumbling through stoplights. It felt normal, but Tasha knew better. Somewhere in the shadows, they were watching her. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, startling her out of her thoughts. It was Riley. "Hey," she answered. "You were right," he said, his tone sharper than usual. "This isn't just some random group messing around. They're organized. I ran a few names I heard through my contacts, and it looks like Marcus, the guy you ran into, has ties to some radical groups. Small, but dangerous enough. They recruit guys who've got nothing better to do and give them a purpose. Problem is, that purpose usually involves targeting people they think don't belong." Tasha's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Did you find anything else?" "Yeah, I did some digging on Marcus specifically. He's been in and out of trouble for years. Petty crimes mostly, but he's been escalating. The group he's connected to has been growing bolder too. Seems like they're trying to make a name for themselves." Tasha's jaw clenched. She'd seen this kind of escalation before. It always started small, intimidation, a few broken windows, someone getting cornered in an alley. But if nobody pushed back, they grew confident, testing how far they could go. The fact that they were targeting her meant they thought she was an easy victory. They thought they could make an example out of her. "Thanks, Riley," Tasha said, her voice steady. "Keep digging. I'll handle things on my end." "Tasha, be careful. These guys. I know what they are." She hung up, the finality of the call lingering in the air. Tasha wasn't scared, but she was angry now. Angry that they thought they could intimidate her. Angry that this was still happening to people like her. And angry that no one seemed to be stopping them. But she would. The day stretched on, each hour slower than the last. Tasha spent it preparing, her military instincts kicking into gear. She checked her surroundings at every turn, memorized faces, patterns, and potential blind spots wherever she went. The city felt different now, like every corner hid a threat waiting to pounce. By nightfall, the tension had reached its peak. Tasha was back in her apartment, pacing the living room, her mind working through every possible scenario. Then it happened, a low thud outside her window. She froze, her breath caught mid-inhale. Slowly, she moved to the window and peered out into the dark. At first, she saw nothing. The street lights flickered lazily, casting long shadows against the cracked pavement. Then she saw it. A car parked across the street, its engine off, but two faint silhouettes were visible inside, watching. Tasha turned away from the window, her pulse steady. They were testing her patience now, poking at her boundaries to see if she would break. She grabbed her keys, slipped her jacket on, and walked out of the apartment. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her skin, sharp and crisp. The car didn't move. Tasha walked purposefully across the street, her footsteps echoing faintly in the silence. She stopped in front of the car, close enough to see the two men inside. Marcus in the passenger seat, the wiry man from earlier at the wheel. Marcus rolled the window down, his face smug, as he looked up at her. Couldn't stay away, huh? Tasha stared him down, her face unreadable. What do you want? Marcus laughed, a low, mocking sound that made her skin prickle. We want to remind people like you where you stand. People like me. Marcus's smile widened, his eyes dark with twisted pride. Yeah, you think you're tough, because you got lucky in that alley. But you're not tough. You're alone. Tasha's gaze didn't waver. She could see the confidence in his expression, the way he fed off the power he thought he had. It was the same look she'd seen in men overseas, men who thought cruelty made them strong. You're wrong about one thing, she said quietly. What's that? I'm not alone. Before Marcus could react, headlights appeared at the end of the block, bright and sudden. The sound of engines revving filled the air, growing louder as two black SUVs turned onto the street and came barreling toward them. Marcus's smirk faded instantly, his body tensing as he looked at the approaching vehicles. Tasha didn't move. She knew exactly who was in those SUVs. Marcus panicked, shouting at his friend to start the car. The engine sputtered to life, and the car jerked forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. The two SUVs flanked them in seconds, boxing them in. Doors flew open, and a group of men stepped out, dressed in plain clothes, but moving with a precision that only came from military training. Riley was at the front, his expression calm but deadly serious. Evening, gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying across the tense silence. Marcus looked between Riley and Tasha, his face pale now, the bravado wiped clean. Who the hell are you people? Tasha stepped closer, her voice even. We're the ones who stop people like you. Marcus glared at her, anger and fear flickering in his eyes. This isn't over, he spat. Tasha tilted her head slightly, the hint of a smile on her lips. I'm counting on it. The tension in the air was thick as Marcus and his friend were dragged out of the car, their protests drowned out by the sound of Riley's team securing the scene. Tasha watched it all unfold, her expression calm, but inside she knew the real battle hadn't even begun. Marcus and his crew weren't the top of the food chain. They were pawns emboldened by something, or someone bigger. The pieces were moving now, and Tasha could feel it. This was just the beginning, and whatever was coming next, she would be ready for it. As Riley approached her, his face grim, he gave her a small nod. We'll keep an eye on them, but you're right. This isn't over. I know, Tasha replied softly, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The night was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt calm. It felt like the deep breath before a storm. And Tasha wasn't one to run from a storm. Tasha stood with Riley as the last echoes of the confrontation faded into the dark. The men from Marcus's group had been taken, their cocky bravado shattered, but Tasha didn't allow herself to feel relieved. Something gnawed at her, a familiar unease she'd learned to trust over the years. This wasn't the end. The way Marcus had looked at her before he was hauled off, spiteful, defiant, made it clear. He wasn't just angry. He was confident, as though he still held some card no one else could see. "Don't let your guard down," Tasha murmured to Riley, her voice low. He glanced at her, his sharp instincts catching the edge in her tone. What are you thinking? They're too comfortable. Marcus isn't the leader here. He's too sloppy, too reckless. There's someone else pulling the strings. Riley frowned, processing her words. You think he's reporting to someone higher up? I don't think. I know. Tasha turned her gaze to the horizon, where the SUV's taillights were disappearing into the night. And they're not done with me. Riley crossed his arms, his expression grim. I'll have my guys look deeper into Marcus's connections. But if they're this bold already, they'll retaliate. You can't do this alone, Tasha. Tasha looked at him, her face unreadable. I didn't plan to. But even as she said it, Tasha knew that whoever was behind Marcus wouldn't let this go. They'd pushed hard against her, expecting her to break. And now that she pushed back, the stakes had shifted. People like this didn't quit when they felt pressure. They doubled down. That's what worried her. The next morning, the tension hadn't lifted. Tasha's phone rang earlier than usual, jolting her awake. She grabbed it from the nightstand, blinking against the early sunlight. It was Riley. Talk to me, she said as she sat up. You're not going to like this, Riley said, his voice clipped. Marcus and his friend, they're out. Tasha froze, her blood running cold. What do you mean they're out? Someone bailed them out last night. Not long after we brought them in. My contacts are saying it wasn't local either. Someone with resources came in and paid their way out without hesitation. Tasha's grip on the phone tightened. This was bigger than she thought. Whoever Marcus worked for wasn't just organized. They had money, connections, and the confidence to step in when their people got into trouble. This wasn't just a gang or a group of hot-headed bullies trying to make noise. It was something else entirely. Riley's voice broke through her thoughts. You still there? Yeah, Tasha said quietly. I'm here. There's more, Riley added, hesitation in his voice. After they were bailed out, they disappeared. No one's seen them. It's like they just vanished. Tasha stood up and began pacing the room, her mind spinning. Vanishing meant regrouping. They weren't scared, they were planning. And Tasha had a sinking feeling that she was at the center of whatever came next. Get me everything you can on Marcus and his connections, she said, her voice sharp. If someone stepped in to clean up their mess, I want to know who it was. Already on it, Riley said. Just be careful, Tasha. These people are playing a different game now. Tasha ended the call and stared out the window. The city was alive outside, the streets bustling with people who had no idea what was happening beneath the surface. That was the way these groups liked it, hidden in plain sight, untouchable because they seemed invisible to everyone who wasn't looking. She had a feeling they weren't going to stay invisible much longer. By midday, Tasha was back in her car, retracing her steps from the day before. She'd learned a long time ago that the best way to find answers was to keep moving, to let trouble find her instead of waiting for it to come knocking. She drove through the neighborhoods Marcus and his crew frequented, keeping an eye out for familiar faces. The wiry man, the heavy-set one with the scar. Someone had to be lurking. By the time the sun began to dip low, she was growing frustrated. Then she saw it. A car, black and low, with tinted windows, pulled into an alley just a block ahead of her. Tasha's gut told her to follow, so she did. She parked at the edge of the alley and slipped out of the car, her footsteps silent. The alley was narrow and cluttered with dumpsters, the hum of a running engine, the only sound cutting through the stillness. As she crept forward, she caught sight of them. Marcus was there, standing near the car with a phone to his ear, his posture tense. The wiry man was pacing nearby, throwing anxious glances toward Marcus as he spoke. Tasha ducked behind a dumpster, her heart steady as she listened. "Yeah, we're keeping an eye on her," Marcus was saying into the phone. His voice was lower now, stripped of the arrogance he'd had before. "No, she's not backing down. She's more of a problem than we thought." There was a pause, then Marcus sighed. "I'll take care of it. I promise." He ended the call and shoved the phone into his pocket. The wiry man stepped closer, his voice low. "What'd he say?" Marcus glanced around nervously. "We're supposed to scare her off, make her disappear if we have to." Tasha's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. Whoever Marcus was talking to wasn't just trying to intimidate her anymore. They wanted her gone. This wasn't about proving a point or keeping their pride intact. She was in the way of something they weren't willing to risk. The wiry man spoke again, his voice wavering. "You sure we can handle this? She's not normal, man." She's one woman," Marcus cut him off sharply. "We'll handle her." He said we have help on the way anyway. Tasha froze at that. Help. This wasn't just Marcus and his group anymore. Someone bigger was sending reinforcements, people who were likely more dangerous, more trained, and more determined than the sloppy group she'd dealt with so far. Tasha slipped back into the shadows, her mind racing. If Marcus was telling the truth, things were about to get much worse. And whoever was pulling the strings wasn't just protecting Marcus. They were making sure whatever they were planning would be stopped. She knew one thing for certain. She was no longer just reacting. She was running out of time to get ahead of them. The alley disappeared behind her as she returned to her car, her movements quick and deliberate. She could feel the storm building now, a confrontation that had only been simmering beneath the surface, but was about to explode into something much larger. And this time, Tasha wouldn't be the only one in danger. Tasha drove through the city streets, her hands steady on the wheel as her mind pieced everything together. Marcus was small time, a pawn in something much bigger, and now reinforcements were coming. People more dangerous, more calculating. Whoever they were, they didn't just want her out of the way, they wanted her erased. The message was clear. Tasha had pushed too far, and now they were pushing back with everything they had. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was Riley. She answered on speaker. "I found something," he said, his tone urgent. "You were right. Marcus' crew is tied to a network operating under the radar. They've got ties to organized groups, people who recruit, train, and fund guys like Marcus to stir up chaos. And Tasha, there's someone new pulling the strings. Someone connected to military contractors." Tasha's pulse quickened, though her voice stayed calm. "Military contractors." "Yeah, I can't get a name yet. But it's not just some local thug. Whoever bailed Marcus out has money and connections that run deep. They don't want attention. They want control." Tasha's jaw tightened as she processed this. She'd seen groups like this before. People who wore suits in boardrooms while funding chaos on the ground, using people like Marcus to keep their hands clean. They made their moves carefully, staying invisible. Until now. "Where's Marcus now?" she asked. Riley hesitated. "He's holed up at an abandoned shipping yard on the edge of the city. My guess is they're regrouping and waiting for their help to arrive." Tasha exhaled slowly, a calm determination settling over her. "Send me the location." "Tasha, you can't go in alone," Riley said, the concern heavy in his voice. "These guys aren't playing anymore. You don't know what we're walking into." "I know exactly what I'm walking into," she replied. "I don't need an army, Riley, just eyes on the exits." She ended the call before he could argue, and within moments, her phone pinged with the address. She turned the car onto the highway, the city lights blurring in the distance as she sped toward the yard. The closer she got, the quieter her mind became. The world around her disappeared until there was only the mission ahead. The shipping yard sat like a forgotten relic, massive and empty, surrounded by fences topped with barbed wire. It was dark, the only light coming from a few dim lamps scattered across the lot. Tasha parked a block away, slipping into the shadows as she approached on foot. From a distance, she spotted movement. Marcus was there, pacing near a stack of crates. The wiry man was with him, along with two others she didn't recognize, men who moved differently, like they were trained. These were the reinforcements. They were armed, their silhouettes sharp against the faint glow of the lamps. Tasha took cover behind a rusted container, her instincts kicking into gear. She watched their movements, memorizing their patterns. Marcus was nervous, snapping at the others and constantly checking his phone. The two new men, however, were calm, focused, exactly the type of people you'd expect to handle a job like this. Tasha's gut told her Marcus didn't even understand how expendable he was. Then, from across the lot, she heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. Headlights cut through the darkness as a black SUV rolled into view. It stopped near Marcus, and a man stepped out. A man Tasha didn't recognize. He was older, tall, and clean-cut, wearing a fitted jacket that spoke of quiet authority. He walked with purpose, and when he spoke, even Marcus fell silent. Tasha couldn't hear his words, but she could see the fear in Marcus's body language. The man was clearly someone who expected obedience. As the man spoke, Marcus began pointing toward the perimeter, gesturing as if explaining something. Tasha's stomach turned as realization hit. He was telling them about her, about what happened in the alley, about who she was. The man's face remained impassive as he listened. Then he turned back toward his men, giving a signal. One of them pulled a small black case from the SUV and opened it. Even from a distance, Tasha recognized it immediately. A drone controller. She barely had time to react before she heard the whirring sound of something lifting into the air. A drone. They weren't waiting to find her. They were hunting her. Tasha moved quickly, slipping through the shadows and putting as much distance between herself and her last position as possible. She crouched low behind a container as the drone hovered overhead, its camera sweeping the yard like a silent predator. She reached for her phone and called Riley. "Riley," she whispered, "they've got a drone on me. I need you to disrupt it now." "I'm on it," Riley said immediately. "Hang tight." The drone's hum grew louder as it passed overhead, its camera lens glinting faintly in the light. Tasha kept still, her breathing shallow. Moments passed that felt like hours. Then suddenly, the drone wavered mid-air, its movements jerky. The hum faltered, and then nothing. The drone dropped like a stone, crashing to the ground with a metallic thud. Tasha didn't wait, she moved. The crash sent Marcus and his men into a frenzy, their shouts echoing across the yard. What happened? Marcus yelled, his voice cracking. Tasha slipped closer, using the confusion to her advantage. One by one, she took them out. The wiry man never saw her coming as she knocked him unconscious behind the crates. One of the new guys went down with a chokehold, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. Marcus panicked now, his shouts turning desperate. "Where is she?" "Find her." The tall man with the jacket remained calm, watching the chaos unfold with narrowed eyes. He knew. Tasha stepped into the open, her presence sudden and deliberate. Marcus turned and froze when he saw her. "You," he stammered, stumbling back. "How?" "End of the line, Marcus," she said quietly. Before he could respond, the man in the jacket stepped forward, clapping a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You've done enough," he said coolly. Marcus looked confused. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze to Tasha, his expression unreadable. "You're impressive," he said, his voice calm. "But you don't understand what you're stopping." "I understand enough," Tasha replied, keeping her stance ready. The man gave a small smile, almost amused. "This isn't over. You think cutting off a branch stops the tree from growing?" Tasha's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here to trim branches. I'm here to burn the roots." The man regarded her for a moment longer, then gave a subtle nod, almost like an acknowledgement of respect. He turned to leave, his calm demeanor unshaken. Marcus, however, wasn't so lucky. Riley's team arrived just as Marcus tried to flee, driving him back into the center of the chaos. As the sound of sirens began to grow in the distance, Tasha stood still, watching the man disappear into the shadows. She knew he wasn't gone. Men like him always found another way. But as she looked at Marcus, desperate, defeated, she knew this part of the fight was over. For now, the real battle, the one against the people hidden behind layers of power and influence, was still waiting. But Tasha wasn't afraid. She had faced worse, and she wasn't done yet.